Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna min fadlika ilman ya rabbal alameen. Alhamdulillah, it's a blessing to be here, to be back in the Bay, a place that's like a second home for me. Having spent 3 years here in Berkeley, now about 6 years ago, I graduated, so it's always nice to be back in the Bay and to see these wonderful communities. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all and increase you and protect our communities. As Zain mentioned, we're going to talk tonight about a topic that is so important. The reality is it's something that impacts every single one of us. Young or old, rich or poor, you know, whether a person has $10 or a person has $1 million or $100 million. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut." That everybody's going to pass away. And so the question becomes, what do we do about preparing for that? There's a famous hadith, a tradition that la aqla ka tadbir. There's no intelligence like good planning. And we recognize this in our worldly sense. Everybody has a plan for today and for tomorrow, right? If you look at any corporate executive, their calendar is very organized. You want to schedule some time, you have to put it into the calendar. And you want to be successful in anything, you have to plan for it. And this is very much the same in that we want to plan. And we want to do 3 things. We're going to talk about 3 things, broadly speaking. The first is protecting our family and fulfilling a religious obligation. And thirdly, leaving a legacy. So we're going to talk about all 3 of these things this evening, inshallah. 2 of them are intuitive. That is protecting your family. As we said, everybody's going to pass away. This is the reality of our life. And if you ask anybody, why do you work? It's to feed our family. And so the question then becomes, well, what's going to happen to my family after my death? What's going to happen to my children in the event of incapacity? If I'm unable to earn, well, what's going to happen to my children, to my family, to my spouse, to my parents, those who are dependent upon me? Right? For the men in the room, for those that are supporting their families. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبِمَا أَنفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ. Right? The status of head of the household is due to the fact that you spend on your families. And so there's this natural question of, well, what's going to happen then when I'm no longer around or when I'm no longer able to earn? Right? So that's something that is universal. Muslim, non-Muslim, doesn't matter. Everybody has this concern. In fact, even it's just not even a human limitation. Every animal is even concerned about their family. The second one, which is religious obligation, I'm going to skip over for a minute and talk about the third component, which is leaving a legacy. And I want everyone in the room to think about this a little bit, which is, when we talk about a legacy, we talk about, how are people going to remember me after I'm gone? What was the purpose of my being here? Was I able in any way to enhance the society? Was I beneficial to people? Is anybody going to remember me? Will anybody even make dua for me after my death? It's the concept of a legacy. It's not to show off or anything, but it's really, what am I leaving behind? And I want to tell a story that I think is really powerful here to frame the conversation on the concept of legacy. So there's an individual by the name of John Harvard. Anybody heard of him? Nobody heard of him. Good. He died a long time ago. In fact, in the 1600s. So it's, maybe you never heard his name, which is totally natural. He died in the 1600s, and what makes him so interesting is that he was a religious immigrant. He came to this country, he was a religious man, he was an immigrant, and he died really young. In fact, he died at the age of 30. And so he created a will, and inside of his will, he said, I want to leave half of my wealth to build a library at a then unnamed school or university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You know where this is going? I think everybody knows where this is going. So John Harvard passes away Harvard University is ultimately named after him. Anybody know what Harvard University's endowment size is today? 2 billion? Let's go higher. It's something like 40 billion or higher. $40 billion, if not higher. Started when John Harvard chose to give a gift in his estate plan. Now I want you to think about how many John Harvards there are in our community. Young, wealthy, charitable, religious, immigrant, right? These are things that resonate with our community. And how much potential we have to build institutions. MashaAllah, we're sitting in a wonderful institution surrounded by, very powerful Islamic organizations in the Bay Area, right? How can we make them sustainable and last for generations to come? It's through these endowments. Right? And so we have the opportunity to incorporate those wasiyas into our planning, into our estate planning. And so we'll talk about how to do that as well. And then, of course, we said there's a religious component to this, which is to say that this idea of estate planning is something universal. Everybody talks about it, whether you're Muslim or you're not. The question of leaving a legacy is something that there are all kinds of non-Muslim philanthropists out there that have, large gifts to benefit non-profits of their choosing. But what makes this special for us as Muslims is that this isn't just something optional, it's actually something incumbent, it's actually something mandatory, it's something ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself in the Qur'an. And in fact, it's not just outlined in the Qur'an, but it's the only religious obligation that is expressly laid out in the Qur'an itself. I want you to think about this for a minute. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. He says, آتُوا الزَّكَاةِ. He says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامِ. He says, أَتِمُّوا الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ. He tells us pray, he tells us give zakah, go for hajj, and fast in Ramadan. He doesn't tell us in the Qur'an itself how to do them. In other words, we just prayed Maghrib. Is there anywhere in the Qur'an that says how many rak'ahs is Maghrib? Will you find it? You won't. Person goes for hajj. Do tawaf, then do sa'i, then go and do jamarat, and then do a qurbani and shave your head. All of these things. Are any of those things mentioned in the Qur'an? The order, what to do? No. All of those things, how much zakat, what nullifies my fast, what breaks my fast, all of those things are laid out in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in the books of Sunnah and in the books of fiqh. There's one exception, in which is this topic of inheritance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala outlines in express detail. Mother gets this, father gets this, son gets this, wife gets this, husband gets this, brother gets this, sister gets this. All of these things are laid out in the Qur'an itself in Surah An-Nisa. That's fascinating, and we're going to go over some of those today, inshallah. So I want you to recognize how important it is from a religious obligation perspective that the Prophet ﷺ actually says, تَعَلَّمُوا الْفَرَائِضْ وَعَلِّمُوهُ فَإِنَّهُ نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ. He actually says, learn and teach inheritance law, for verily it's half of all knowledge. And so this is actually one of the great honors and privileges that I feel to be able to share with you today, is that we're actually fulfilling this religious injunction, which is learn and teach inheritance law, for verily it's half of all knowledge. So, and yet I refer to this as what we would say as a forgotten fard. And the reason is that it's not something anybody talks about. It's not something that, given the significance that I just outlined, it's not something that we really talk about. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, تَعَلَّمُوا الْفَرَائِضْ وَعَلِّمُوهُ فَإِنَّهُ نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ. And he says that أَوَّلُ شَيْءٍ يُنْزَعُ مِنْ أُمَّتِي, or كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, that it's going to be the first thing that is lifted from my ummah. This is pretty fascinating. Now, a pause for a moment. Why do you all think that it's described as half of all knowledge? Let's keep it a little bit interactive. I know everybody had a long day, and it's Friday night. So, why is this described as half of all knowledge? And why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala providing these express shares in the Qur'an itself? as opposed to all our other religious injunctions. What do you think? Anybody? It's very technical. It's extremely technical. What was the second point? A lot of combinations, permutations. Yes, absolutely. But it still bears the question as to why is it described as half of all knowledge? He doesn't say learn salah, it's half of all knowledge. Or learn zakah. Why inheritance? We're dealing with relatives, right? And the scholars give explanations for this. Some of them, or one of them, which is mentioned, is that it's going to impact so many relationships. So many relationships are impacted by this distribution of wealth on death. Let me take a quick survey. I like to just somewhat engage. How many people know in their families, close or distant, some dispute that occurred among family members relating to inheritance? Show of hands. Just about everybody, right? This is a universal issue, that there's after death some disputes that occur, and so many relationships are impacted by this fulfillment of inheritance law. And another explanation, which is really beautiful, is this is the only thing that you're responsible for doing after your death. If you take half of your knowledge, it's all relating to things that you have to do today. There's one thing you have to do after death. You're not going to be able to physically do it. The only way it's going to happen is if you made a plan. If you created a plan for this to happen, then inshallah, I mean, you can never guarantee it, but inshallah, it'll get fulfilled. But if you don't make a plan, then there's a very slim chance that things will happen the way they're supposed to happen. So this is described as half of all knowledge. Now, it's also described as the first thing which is lifted from this ummah. So if you think about how many halaqas, how many khutbahs, how many khatiras we have attended in our lifetime, what percentage of them are relating to this topic which I'm describing as so important? How many people have even been to a seminar or a khutbah or a halaqa on this topic? About 3, 4, right? So it goes to show you that this is the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ is very true. In our time today, he says, أَوَّلُ شَيْءٍ نُزَوْ مِنْ أُمَّتِي مِنْ أُمَّتِي أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. And he goes a step further, which is to say that learn inheritance and teach it, for a time will come where people will dispute over an issue of inheritance and they won't find anybody to be able to arbitrate the issue. And I think that point is even more true today. I shouldn't say more true, but is very true today. In the sense that living here in America, not only do we have to think about the religious component to this, but we have to think about how does that interplay with state law? How does that interplay with tax law? How does that interplay with community property in California? How does that interplay with the right of survivorship that I have on my house? All of these complex questions come into play. And so it's actually an incredible prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ that he says that this would be the case, that people wouldn't find an arbitrator. So I want to pause here for a moment and frame the conversation about what's our intention here as we're gathered together in this wonderful, beautiful masjid. I want to think about our intention. The Prophet ﷺ says that, he tells Abu Dhar in a famous hadith, he says that, "O Abu Dhar, if you go out, لَن تَغْدُوا فَتَتَعَلَّمَ بَابًا مِنَ الْعِلْمِ عُمِلَ بِهِ أَوْ لَمْ يُعْمَلْ بِهِ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ أَن تُصَلِّيَ أَلْفَ رَكَعَةٍ." He says, "O Abu Dhar, if you go out and learn a chapter of knowledge, whether you implement it or not, it's better for you than praying 1,000 raka'at of optional prayer." It was incredible. Think about how long that would take. And so we have the opportunity to do that today, is to learn a topic at a high level. Obviously, we're not going to delve into all the details, but we're going to learn a high level of what is Islamic inheritance law. And so I want that to be everybody's first intention, that we're going to learn fulfilling the commandment of the Prophet ﷺ to learn and teach inheritance law, and to attain this incredible virtue and honor of this reward that the Prophet ﷺ describes. And secondly, the hope is that and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq in doing this, is that you recognize the importance of this topic, such that it motivates you to actually fulfill a plan and create something that fulfills the obligation. Now, whether you do that with us, with Zain and myself, or you do that with any other attorney, that's totally your prerogative. But my hope is that you understand the high level of the importance and how to interplay the two so that you actually create some sort of plan. And we're actually going to give everybody the opportunity to create, at a basic level, a free will, an automate template that you can do on a basic level. And of course, people that need more will have to do more sophisticated planning. So let's do a quick outline of our agenda. We have Isha at what time today? 8:15? Perfect. So we're going to go for about an hour. And we're going to cover a few topics, inshallah. And then we're going to have some time after Isha as well for Q&A at the end. Perhaps at the end of this session, or if it flows over, then we'll have time after Isha as well. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is estate planning. Right? A lot of people think that, oh, that's something for just the really rich people. What does it mean? So we'll talk about what is estate planning. And then as a corollary, who needs an estate plan? Again, is that something just for old people? Is it something for rich people? Is it something for the average person? Who really needs this? Who does this impact? Why does it even matter? And then this question is very important. What makes a plan Islamic? We're going to spend a lot of time on Islamic Inheritance Law. For instance, you know, if I create a will and I put this halal stamp on it, is that going to make it Islamic? Right? Is there some sort of process by which something becomes an Islamic estate plan, a sharia-compliant plan? So we're going to talk about that. And then what is an estate plan anyways? Okay, you recognize what it is, but what are the documents? What are the pieces as Muslims living in America that we need inside of this plan? And then, like I said, often some of the best conversation in these presentations is really the Q&A. What I would ask is to hold your questions till the Q&A session so that we can get through as much of this as we can in a streamlined manner, and then inshallah you can write down your questions and save them for the end, and we'll have plenty of time, and like I said, I'll be here after Isha as well to answer questions. Those questions should, however, be generally applicable. If a person has particular questions about their unique situation, then those are better served in private. So, what's the first thing you do when you are talking to an attorney, however? Anybody ever talk to an attorney? So the first thing you do is what? Is the disclaimer, right? So after all, I am an attorney, as Zain mentioned. Zain's an attorney as well. So I already talked too much without providing a disclaimer. So I just need everybody to agree to this short disclaimer so we can continue, inshallah. So if you would just agree, you can consent, we'll go ahead and proceed. No, really, it's on a light note, but the reality is this is generally applicable information. We're talking about what is Islamic inheritance law and how do we implement that as Muslims in the United States? How do we integrate these things? This is sort of a high-level conversation, an introduction to the topic, an encouragement to learn more. It's not an attorney-client privilege. Don't go and do something and then sue me, right? That's the gist of it. Very good. So, what's an estate? What's an estate? Somebody tell me. We're talking about estate planning. If we don't know, the first thing you do in any field or discipline is to define the terminology. When you study a text, you have to understand the terminology. Same thing here. If I'm talking about estate planning, you're thinking about something else, I'm thinking about something else, it's kind of pointless. So what's an estate? Your assets. That's still sort of a hard word. What are assets? Property. Let's make it simpler. Stuff. Your stuff. Everything, right? Savings. And also, in addition to the things that you have, the assets, the stuff, there are also potentially debts, right? There are debts, obligations as well. So when we talk about planning, we're also talking about comprehensive planning that accounts for all of our debts and obligations and all of our assets to be. Now I was messed up my slides. I was supposed to say that most people think of something like this, right? When you think of an estate, you think of something like this, right? That's typically the first thing. Well, I don't have an estate. That's what everybody tells me. Oh, that's cool, you're an estate planning attorney? I don't have an estate, but I'll tell my friend, right? Because most people think of something like this. And the reality is it's all your stuff. So if you have this home in Pleasanton, I tried to find a Pleasanton home, and I think this is what they look like. So we're gonna skip over this one quickly. And then all of your stuff, right? So the official Muslim car outside is the Toyota Camry. And not just that, but for our sisters, all of the jewelry, the gold that you got on your wedding that you may have in a lockbox somewhere in a bank that's never been worn again, that's your estate. That's thinking about, what's going to happen to that, and I have a religious obligation. Now, whether a person has, as I said, $10 to their name or 10 million or 100 million, it doesn't matter. There's a religious obligation to ensure that it's distributed in a Sharia-compliant manner. So what are the goals of estate planning? When I talk about an estate, great. What are the goals of estate planning? At a high level, what are you thinking? Do what Allah asks us to. Very good. So let's kind of go through this in order. The first thing that we want to say is, I want to control my property while I'm alive and well. And why do I start with that? Because one type of estate plan is to just give everything away. If I gave everything away and I have nothing, well then I've fulfilled my religious obligation. I don't have to do anything because I don't have any money. So you could theoretically gift everything you have away. You could give it to your kids, you could give it to your spouse. You could do all kinds of different things so that you don't have any assets when you die. Now typically, in about 100% of cases, people don't want to do this. Right? Nobody wants to give all their stuff away while they're alive. Doesn't make any sense. Because you might end up being homeless tomorrow. Right? So that's the first goal, is I want to own my assets in a way that I'm still controlling them while I'm alive and well. And notice I said control here. I didn't say ownership, because we have the ability to create trusts and LLCs and business vehicles and investment vehicles and things in which we still control them, but we might technically not own them, from a technical matter. The second thing is, most people don't die suddenly. Most people don't die suddenly. Statistically speaking, may Allah protect us and grant us afiyah, most people have some period of incapacity or something. And so we want to take care of ourselves and our loved ones when we become disabled or pass away. And this can be, with the advances in medical and modern technology, a person can be in a state of incapacity for quite a long time. Right? Anybody seen this in your families, communities, where a person is in this sort of neither here nor there state? And so we want to think about that, and we want to plan for that. We're not only talking about financial assets, we're also talking about our person, as to how to make healthcare decisions in the event of incapacity. These can be actually, for anybody that's dealt with them before, these can actually be very traumatic and emotional times where people are sort of, debating what to do and end-of-life care. Third is what our sister mentioned, which is give what we have to whom we want the way we want. Give what we have to whom we want the way we want. Now, as Muslims, this is something that's really important, because Jazakallah khair. Thank you. Jazakallah khair. The way we want to whom we want is the Islamic way, the Quranic way, the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in the Qur'an itself, right? So a person, I have this conversation once, a person came up and we were having this initial consult, and I was telling him, he wasn't Muslim, and I was telling him, okay, well yeah, after your death you can, leave this to your family and your spouse and your kids and this and that. I said, oh, that's really cool. At the end of it he said, all right, well I'm more interested in leaving something to my pets. And it was like the first time to me that but this is the reality. People have these thoughts that I want to leave everything to my cat or to my dog. And we laugh here. But this is real. People want to leave things to their pets. Why? Because at the end of the day, their kids abandon them. They don't treat them with respect. The only person that jumps on them and takes care of them and hugs them when they come home every day after work are their pets. He said, I want to leave all my assets in trust to my dogs or whatever, right? And so I see people kind of shaking their heads. But we want to do things the Islamic way. And this is an important point, that the state will respect that if we do it properly. That there are default rules in the state that will apply should we do nothing. However, if we create a plan that is legally enforceable, the state is going to respect our wishes. And that's the beauty of living as Muslims in America. That if we want to, we can do things properly that are consistent with our faith, and in fact, overrule default rules. And this one's important. We want to do it in an efficient manner. Nobody wants to waste money, right? So you want to save every legal cost. We said at the beginning, someone said lawyers are expensive. I think that's true. Probate costs are expensive, right? Anybody know what probate is? Pause on that for a moment. Yes, what is it? When a person passes away, the court system is going to oversee the distribution of assets. In theory, that's a good idea. So prevents fraud and people from stealing assets and things like that. But as a practical matter, it's very inefficient, it's very expensive. And you all live in the Bay, everything's more expensive. Dying is more expensive in the Bay and in California than other parts of the country as well, right? So probate costs are pretty high here. And in fact, the cost of dying itself and funeral and all of those things is pretty expensive as well. What is that here? What is the cost of a burial, janazah, the whole process here? Someone passes away. How much? 7,000 to 8,000. In Phoenix, it's about half of that, where I live. So 7,000 to 8,000, it's not insignificant, right? And we want to think about these things moving forward. So what makes a plan Islamic? What makes a plan Islamic? That symbol, right? That certification, that halal that you put on it, that's going to make the will Islamic. What makes a plan Islamic? Follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, right? That's the essence of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, actually before that, I want to think about the way that we view wealth. In reality, wealth is a trust from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wealth is a trust. We're just trustees of that wealth. It's not actually ours. It belonged to somebody before us and it will belong to somebody after us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, وَآتُوهُم مِّن مَّالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. He talks about giving them from Allah's wealth that He's given you, He's entrusted you. And we say, وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. To Allah belongs everything in the heavens and the earth. So He gave us this wealth, right? Even if you think, no, well, we generated this wealth. It's not true in essence, right? Everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have a responsibility to earn our wealth in a religiously compliant manner. Meaning, I couldn't, for instance, go and open up a casino. Everybody's going to say that's silly, that's haram. You know that, you know better. So we all strive to earn our wealth in a religiously permissible manner. Everybody agree? Of course. The second thing is we have to spend our wealth in a religiously permissible manner. So I earn a halal income and I go then spend it at a casino. Would that be permissible? Could I say it's my wealth, I do what I want with it? No, of course not. Everybody recognizes that's also silly and you wouldn't do that. You don't waste halal money in a haram way. And the third component of that is after death, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribes what has to happen to our wealth. We don't have, as Muslims, unlimited discretion to make those decisions. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتِ إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that it's a duty on the righteous to create a plan to benefit those close family members. Now this verse actually, the scholars explain that this verse was abrogated by the revelation of the ayat of inheritance. Meaning in the beginning it was the responsibility of the Muslims to ensure that their family members received some portion. Once the ayat of Surah Nisa were revealed, they became mandatory. They became mandatory. And Allah says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ. These are the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we'll talk about those in a minute. And there's a famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he says that it's not permissible for a Muslim to allow 2 days to pass to have some assets and not to create a will. Not to create an estate plan, if you will. Now again, if you live in a Muslim country or in a Muslim society or under Muslim rule, historically, you didn't actually have to do anything, because the default system in to this day, any Muslim majority country, regardless of how Muslim or Islamic the government is Islamic inheritance law. Right? No matter what country you come from and how sort of un-Islamic the government may be, in any Muslim majority country, this is a default system. Not to say there aren't disputes and there aren't fights and there isn't dhulm that's occurring. All of that does happen. But you didn't need to affirmatively do any work. That's certainly not the case here. If you want to ensure that you do things religiously here, you have to do something. You have to do work to ensure that the obligation is fulfilled. Was it a quick question? Yeah, in India as well, which is not Muslim majority, but sizable enough of a population that Muslim law governs as a default matter. If a Muslim dies, even in India, in fact, as ironic as this is, even in areas that are occupied by Israel, they are also, and a Muslim person passes away, despite that occupation, they even will have a default system of inheritance. So this is something that around the world happens easier than here. You have to do something. Now again, we said the beauty of living as Muslims in America is that you have a lot of freedom. You have a lot of opportunity to do things religiously and compliant with your faith. So, let's do a quick overview of Islamic inheritance law. What happens first when a person passes away? What's the first thing that is paid? Before debts is funeral expenses, okay? I mean, that has to happen, right? It's natural. In our tradition, we don't have, a week goes by and there's embalming and there's a period of mourning, all of these things. A person passes away, they're supposed to be buried as quickly as possible, as soon as practicable, in a nearby graveyard, right? Following all of the Muslim tradition and custom. So the first thing are funeral and burial expenses. As we said, in $7,000 to $8,000 potentially, if not more, just related to the funeral, burial, ghusl, janazah, buying the plot, etc. What's next? Debts. Okay? Now, let's pause here for a moment and talk about something from an Islamic financial ethics perspective, which is we live in a world in which everyone is consumed by debt. And this is antithetical to our tradition, which is to say that debt is discouraged in our tradition. The voluntary taking of debt is not something that's encouraged. In fact, it's discouraged. So much so that we know that the Prophet ﷺ would not pray the janazah over a person who had debts outstanding. And this is scary, that a person's deeds are suspended until their debts are paid off. Now, I didn't say it's haram. I said it's not something that is encouraged. We live in a world where people have student debt, house debt, credit card debt, car payments, mortgages, you name it, just buried under debt. And to the extent possible, we should try to get out of that. This is a tangent a little bit from the core topic of the evening, but it's important. Is that recognize that the first thing that has to be paid back are debts. The first thing that has to be paid back. Now, if the estate is wiped out because we've borrowed so much, now some debts are forgiven on death, I understand, and most are not, in fact. It's an oppressive system that we live in, that your heirs now inherit and assume a person's debts. So we want to be really cognizant of that. The other thing to think about is that when we borrow from each other, often we do it as brothers and we don't really write anything down. And now all of a sudden there's a fight. He owed me this, she owed me this, right? And we should write all of these things down to make sure that our rights that we owe to others are fulfilled. Because if our deeds are going to be suspended, then it's something that we want to be very careful about. And again, I want to reiterate, I didn't say it's impermissible. There's plenty of tradition to support that borrowing or leveraging, in a sense, is okay as a business tactic, but it should be done with caution, and it should be done understanding the risks as well. So debts and obligations. Obligations here as well, meaning there is another kind of debt which are debts owed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, what do I mean by that? For instance, if there are religious obligations that a person did not fulfill, what's a very common one that we're probably all familiar with? Zakat, Hajj, right? A person has the means to go for Hajj but doesn't go for Hajj. They have the means, this is the key, that Hajj was wajib on that person and they chose to delay it, right? This is an unfulfilled religious obligation. And then they can have a person go, and again, some of the scholars say that you should in fact write down what those outstanding debts are so that they can be fulfilled on your behalf. And you can do that, and they would be part of your wasiyah, which is, the wasiyah is typically thought of as the will. It's translated as a will. But in reality, in the fiqh language, we're talking about a technical term here, which relates to a discretionary bequest of up to 1/3 of your estate. A discretionary bequest of up to 1/3 of your estate. This is where the endowment piece comes in. This is where the sustainability of our institutions comes in. This is where that future comes in. This famous narration, the Sahabi came to the Prophet ﷺ, he said, I want to give all my wealth away. He said, you can't. He said, I want to give half of it. He said, no. He said, I want to give 1/3 of it. Can I do that? The Prophet ﷺ says that 1/3 وَالثُّلُثُ كَثِيرٌ, and even 1/3 is a lot. Now, I think this is remarkable, because if you think about it, are there any people here that are familiar with the finances of the masjid, like on the board level, or know how many people have left charitable bequests to the masjid here? Anybody know? Right? People have passed away, right? I would assume. I mean, some, maybe. So this goes to show you, right? As our community ages, as people pass away, it's important that we leave these gifts, particularly if a person's children are adults. Now think about it. Whatever you give away, you're decreasing the pie from your family. So that it's sadaqah to make sure, and the Prophet ﷺ says, don't leave your children in need. So don't give all your wealth away and leave your kids with nothing. But if your kids are adults, if they're 30 years old, if they're 40 years old, they have their own wealth, they're independent financially, then let's utilize that wasiyah to build endowments, right? To make sustainable institutions and organizations. It's very valuable. This is how hospitals, churches, synagogues, museums, universities, this is how they large gifts are often left in estate plans. Also, if a person's very wealthy, there's also tax benefits to doing this as well. This is called a wasiyah. The fourth thing is what's known as al-fara'id, the mandatory system of distributions under Islamic law. These come by and large from the Qur'an itself. These come by and large from the Qur'an itself. So, we said these come from the Qur'an. Where do they come from in the Qur'an? Surah An-Nisa. Surah An-Nisa, again, what's amazing is that they're found mostly in 3 verses of Surah An-Nisa. Verse number 11, verse number 12, and verse number, what's the last verse of the surah? Anybody know? 160 something, I think. Right? The last verse. So let's talk about them for a minute. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ. This is something that should capture your attention. Allah says, يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ. Allah is giving you a wasiyah with regards to your children. Allah is giving you a wasiyah with regards to your children. Meaning Allah is telling you now how to distribute your wealth. He says, لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. This is the first thing that's mentioned, right? And in the society we live in, this is cause for a lot of alarm. That he says that a male child receives double the share of a female. This is the first thing that's mentioned. Straight out of the Qur'an. And that's because boys are better than girls, right? Of course not, right? People will say, oh my goodness, it's not fair, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first thing he mentions is that boys get double the share of females. Now why is that? Let's pause, this is important. Why is that in our tradition? Right? Our tradition is one in which the males have a financial responsibility towards their female relatives. The females inherit and don't have a responsibility to spend on the other heirs. So the male who inherits has to spend on his wife, on his daughters, on his mother, on his nieces and nephews at times, as well, or nieces, I would say, right? So this is something that's part of the tradition. Now, the rules, the fiqh rules are not in a vacuum. There are also moral rules that are surrounding these as well, which is a person is supposed to have a moral grounding to fulfill those obligations as well. And now we're going to come back to this, where a person can say, well, what about in our day and age? The rules are still binding. How do we ensure that our daughters are protected, and so on and so forth? And we'll talk about that. He says, فَإِن كُنَّ نِسَاءً فَوْقَ اثْنَتَيْنِ فَلَهُنَّ ثُلُثَا مَا تَرَكَ وَإِن كَانَتْ وَاحِدَةً فَلَهَا النِّصْفُ. So the largest share that is outlined in the Qur'an is for a daughter. At least equivalent is for a daughter. That if there's one daughter, she's going to get half of everything. If there are two or more daughters, they're going to split 2/3. وَإِن كَانَتْ وَاحِدَةً فَلَهَا النِّصْفُ. Now Allah talks about the rights of the parents in this verse as well. So we talked about children, now we're going to talk about parents. In this society, in California, in the West in general, do parents typically inherit? Say you have a wife and kids and a parent. Do parents typically inherit anything? Most of the time, no. There are situations, California intestacy law will give to parents, but if you have a wife and kids, your parents don't get anything. And that's kind of mirrors the ethic of our society, meaning these rules that are created, the intestacy codes, are based upon this assumption of what people would want. It's very different from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. Right? So our tradition is one in which we have to take care of our parents. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ties together the obligation to be dutiful to your parents, birrul walidain, with not associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's so important, and it extends after death as well. So Allah says, وَلِأَبَوَيْهِ لِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا السُّدُسُ مِمَّا تَرَكَ إِنْ كَانَ لَهُ وَلَدٌ فَإِنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ وَلَدٌ وَوَرِثَهُ أَبَوَاهُ فَلِأُمِّهِ الثُّلُثُ. That if there are no children or siblings, the mother is going to receive 1/3. Also, if you ever want to test a Hafiz, make him read these ayat. Right? This is the real test for a Hafiz. Can they recite these ayat? This is very challenging. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنْ كَانَ لَهُ إِخْوَةٌ فَلِأُمِّهِ السُّدُسُ. That if there are brothers, meaning the person passes away, they don't have any children, but they have siblings, 2 or more, then the mother's share gets decreased back down from 1/3 down to 1/6. Now you can see there's so many contingencies here. Yes? Yeah, good. So there are what's known as Qur'anic heirs, and there are what's known as asaba and residuary heirs. And so there are those shares that are fixed are going to be allotted first. And then the remainder, those that become asaba, are going to be second. So in this the Qur'anic heirs, let's say if a person has parents, children, and spouse, the parents' share and the spouse's share would come out first, and the spouse's share is going to be mentioned in the next verse. And then the children would receive what's left at that 2-to-1 ratio of male to female, assuming there are male children. The wife is in the next verse. She's coming. The husband and wife coming, both. Yes? What do you mean? Oh, good. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so we'll talk about the application of this. There's all kinds of components as to, one, a property is appreciating and one is not, and how do you value them, and we'll talk about it. So first what I want to do here is lay out at a high level what the shares are, and then we'll talk about, well, how does that work as a practical matter? How do we value, calculate, do all of those things as well? Now what's important here is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something interesting. He lays out these rules. And he says, آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا فريضة من الله إن الله كان عليما حكيما. Normally we think, when we read the end of the ayat, we kind of view them as an afterthought. Just like, oh, إن الله غفور رحيم, well, Wallahu ghafurur rahim, kana aliman hakima. We don't really pay attention to those things, but they're really important. Now let me ask you a question. If a person has a 1-year-old son and a 75-year-old father, which one of them deserves more? Huh? The son. Why? No, I mean, well, who's more deserving? He has a life. Depending on the situation of the father. If he's needy, then maybe. Somebody else said what? The son? Most people are thinking the son. Well, what about the father? He spent his whole life supporting you and taking care of you. Don't you have a sense of indebtedness towards the father? There you go. The point of what I'm trying to say is that we have no idea. If it were left up to us, we would make these arbitrary decisions as the son is more deserving. No, the father is more deserving. No, I think my dad has enough money. I don't really know what he has, but my kid needs more. Right? Allah says, آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. You should have known it was a trick question. Right? So, He says that you don't know your children, your parents, who's going to bring more benefit to you. فَرِيضَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ. These rules are mandatory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself. Now, in case you're thinking, well, I don't really know, maybe I have a better solution. He ends the ayah with, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. Allah is most knowledgeable and most wise. Meaning, just in case you think you're better, think you have a better solution, a system that's more fair, more equitable, more just, right? He's saying no. He created you, He knows what's in your best interest. He knows what's going to be good for society as a whole. And so, He lays out these rules. Now, the next verse, this should be verse number 12, not 11. Allah says, وَلَكُمْ نِصْفُ مَا تَرَكَ أَزْوَاجُكُمْ إِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّهُنَّ وَلَدٌ. Now, here are the rights of the spouse. That if a woman passes away and she's married and she has children or doesn't have children, the widower, the husband, is going to take 1/2. Remember I said the largest share is, one of the largest shares is for a daughter who receives, one daughter receives 1/2. Here the husband would also receive 1/2 in the absence of children. And if there are children, then he would receive 1/4 if she is survived by children. فَإِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّهُنَّ وَلَدٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَكُمْ نِصْفُ مَا تَرَكَ أَزْوَاجُكُمْ إِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّهُنَّ وَلَدٌ فَإِن كَانَ لَهُنَّ وَلَدٌ فَلَكُمُ الرُّبُعُ مِمَّا تَرَكْنَ مِن بَعْدِ وَصِيَّةٍ يُوصِينَ بِهَا أَوْ دَيْنٍ. So after the wasiyah and after the debts are paid. Allah makes clear, after the wasiyah and after the debts are paid. Now, وَلَهُنَّ الرُّبُعُ مِمَّا تَرَكْتُمْ إِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّكُمْ وَلَدٌ فَإِن كَانَ لَكُمْ وَلَدٌ فَلَهُنَّ الثُّمُنُ مِمَّا تَرَكْتُمْ مِن بَعْدِ وَصِيَّةٍ تُوصُونَ بِهَا أَوْ دَيْنٍ. So again, if there is a husband passes away and he is survived by children, his widow would receive 1/4 in the absence of children or 1/8 in the presence of children. Okay? Now, in a scenario where, hypothetically speaking, there were multiple wives, what would happen to the share of the wives? They would share the 1/8, which is one of the reasons that it wouldn't really work. So, no, equivalent at the same time. So you're going to take 100, you're going to take out 1/6 for parents, you're going to take out that 1/8 or 1/4 or 1/2 for the spouse at the same time out of the 100. After wasiyah and dain, after the debts have been paid first, and then that 1/3 comes out, potentially, if you choose to exercise it, up to 1/3. Meaning, for instance, you have $100, 10 of it is debt, 10 of it is as a wasiyah to the masjid, to build an endowment for the future. You're left with 80, then we're going to start taking from that 80, right?
So are these children mentioned here necessarily from previous marriages?
These are the decedent's children. So it's irrespective of whether they are of the joint couple. These are of the person who passed away. If that individual is survived by children, then these shares to the spouse would apply. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about a kalala. What's a kalala? Anybody know what kalala is? Yes. Good. Somebody who has a little bit more technical than that, neither ascendants nor descendants. Because we can skip a parent to go to a grandparent, and we can skip a child to go to grandchild. In that lineal family, there are neither ascendants nor descendants that are entitled to inherit. وَإِنْ كَانَ رَجُلٌ يُورَثُ كَلَالَةً. Allah describes the rights of a kalala. Now this is interesting. You would think that, okay, well, if a person doesn't have parents or children, who cares? Those are the most close relationships, so what? Right? A person is unmarried, doesn't have parents, doesn't have children, who cares? Even that person has a set of heirs under Islamic law. Again, this goes back to this binding obligation on every single person, regardless of who they are survived by and how many assets or what the size of their estate is. Now this is interesting. This third point is in general, when there are equal ranking male and female relatives, the males typically inherit double the share of the females. There's an exception here, and there are a few exceptions, but there's an exception here with respect to maternal siblings. Okay, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's going into a little bit more detail than we want to cover here today. But the ayah says something interesting. It says, وَإِنْ كَانَ رَجُلٌ يُورَثُ كَلَالَةً أَوْ إِمْرَأَةٌ وَلَهُ أَخٌ أَوْ أُخْتٌ فَلِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا السُّدُسُ فإن كانوا أكثر من ذلك فهم شركاء في الثلث من بعد وصية يوصى بها أو دين غير مضار. So, he says that if there are more than one maternal siblings, that they're going to receive 1/6. If there are two or more, they're going to share 1/3, and they're going to share it equally. They're going to share it equally. Why do the maternal siblings share equally when, if they were maternal siblings, meaning same mother, but not same father? Okay? Why do they share equally, whereas if they are full siblings, they take it the 2-to-1 ratio? Anybody know? I have no idea. That's just what it says, right? We don't need to know why. That's what it says. That actually, it doesn't say that expressly in the ayah, but all of the scholars have deduced and agreed upon with unanimity that this reference here is with respect to the maternal siblings. And it's explained in the hadith. That's just what it says. And at some level, Allah says, وَصِيَّةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ. This is a wasiyah from your Lord. And he says here, Wallahu alimun halim, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most knowledgeable, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most kind and forbearing. Again, He knows what's in your best interest, and these rules are not meant in some draconian way or paternalistic way, but rather they are made for the benefit of society and for the benefit of you and your family and your offspring. So everybody is now an expert in Islamic inheritance law, right? You got this, right? So, yeah, let's do this. Let's take an example. I think this is a good sort of move from the theoretical to the practical. You have a quick question? Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Right? So again, there's so many things that are moving parts in all of this. We'll get to community property as well. So I want to first finish high-level Islamic inheritance law, and then the second half is, well, what does that mean here in the US? All right. So let's take an example. We're going to take an example of Ahmed and Sarah, who are married. Okay? Ahmed and Sarah are married. And Sarah has her mother Aisha, and they have 3 children together, Umar, Sumayya, and Khadija. Okay? So, what's going to happen is, on their way home, they were together, Ahmed and Sarah was, and they were in a car accident, and inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, Sarah passes away. So now, who gets what from Sarah's estate? Put aside the question of community property and whatnot. Let's assume that there's clarity as to what she actually owned. It probably is not, but let's for a moment say that we know exactly what Sarah had. Who's going to get what in this scenario? In Islamic law, under Islamic law. Let's take her mother. What does her mother get? 1/6. Good. 1/6. Why is that? Parents get 1/6 if that was what the ayah said, right? There are children, parents are going to get 1/6. What does Ahmed get? Half? It's too generous. 1/4. Why? Because the Qur'an says if there are children, then he gets 1/4. Right? What do the kids get? Umar, Sumayya, and Khadija? Very good. So whatever's left, after we take out those 2 shares, after we paid Sarah's funeral costs and debts and wasiyah, the mother would get 1/6, the husband would get 1/4. Whatever's left of that fraction, if anybody's really good at math and you can do this, it's extra credit. It's 2-to-1 ratio. Well, no, that's the easy math. I'm talking about of the whole. Right? So what that comes out to is 1/4, 1/6, 7/48, 7/48, and 7/24. All right? Now, let's say for a minute that this couple lives in Pleasanton, California, and they did not do any estate planning, and Sarah passes away in the same tragic accident. What is the distribution that's going to happen here? What is it? Probate, okay, maybe. Ahmed gets everything, assuming there's joint survivorship or it's all community property. Either or. Now, what do I mean by that? I guess I'll pause there. So, what is community property? Okay, so a lot of different things. So the default assumption in California, as it is in Arizona, as it is in Texas, and most of the western United States, I think it's like 9 states. Is it 9? Something like that. Is that that's a default assumption that whatever spouses earn inside of a marriage is presumed to be 50-50, regardless of who's earning it. So in other words, if one spouse sits at home, the other spouse makes $100,000, the assumption is that both spouses, so in the case, and it doesn't matter when you're living your life happily, it really comes into play in the case of divorce and comes into place in the case of death. Those are the times where it really matters, which is to say at that point, the assumption is that it's 50-50, and the intestacy law says that the community property is all going to go to the survivor. California's default intestacy rule is going to say that the community property is going to go to the survivor. Now, you don't have to have community property. You could have a prenup, you could have a contract, you could have a postnup, you could have a property agreement, you could opt out of the community property system and say what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, and what we earn is separate. Totally respected by the state if it's in writing. And at that point, this wouldn't necessarily be the rule. Rather, I think we'll come to the example in a second about how this plays out. So what's important here is that how do most people who own a house in California, how is that house owned? Joint tenancy with? That's not how most people own their property. Right of survivorship. Right? Most people own their property as joint tenants with a right of survivorship. Which means what? Well, when one dies, the other joint tenant gets everything. In fact, irrespective of what a will even says. This is important because when we get to a conversation about a will, you're going to have this sort of a realization that actually a will might not achieve the goals that I want to achieve. Okay? So that's what happens here. Now, a lot of people are going to say, look at this picture of Ahmed, nice guy, he has a beard and he's wearing a kufi and he goes to the masjid 5 times a day. So he's just going to take care of everything, right? That's what you're thinking. Nice guy, he's going to take care of it all. So if everything goes to him, big deal, so what? He can fulfill the religious obligation. It's not the end of the world. In fact, we avoided probate on the death of the first spouse because everything went to him, so there was no need for a probate. Seems like a good idea, right? Is it a good idea? Why is that? Yeah, this guy, poor guy, is lonely. So what happens a few years later, a few months later, whatever, right? Hajar comes into the picture. All right, so Hajar comes into the picture. She has 2 kids of a previous marriage. So she has Sami and Nadim. They both are from her previous marriage. There was a tragic accident where her husband passed away, and as a coincidence, they started talking and they got married. Now, Ahmed still doesn't learn his lesson. So he still doesn't create a estate plan. Now what happens is, poor guy, he's leaving, one time he's traveling, he gets into a car accident, and inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, he passes away. Now remember, Sarah's already out of the picture. Sarah's already out of the picture, and he still had his 3 kids, Umar, Sumayyah, and Khadija. So now when Ahmed passes away, what happens? This is a little problematic now. So, what's going to happen here is Hajar is going to take 100% of what? Of the community property. Again, now this is important. He may have come into the marriage and said, what's mine is mine, and we're not going to have it all as community, but rather we're going to have some separate property. But assuming he doesn't, and he gets married and he says to Hajar, I love you, and I want to buy a house with you, and so they purchase a home, and that's what happens. So she gets all of the community plus 1/3 of the separate property. So if he had any separate property, which he says this is mine only, and we're not going to commingle it, and most of the time people don't even do this, but assuming he did, she's even going to get a share from there. Now what happens on Hajar's death? Who gets Hajar's wealth? Her kids. It's not going to go to her ex or her previous stepchildren. I don't even know what the relationship is called at that point. But her husband who passed away, his children, no wealth is obviously going to go over to those kids. So then what do these kids get? Umar, Sumayyah, and Khadija, they might get something, because remember, 1/3 of the separate property went to Hajar, so there's still 2/3 of separate property potentially, which might go to Umar, Sumayyah, and Khadija, maybe if there was separate property. What about the mother? Remember the mother? Aisha. Nothing. So her rights are infringed upon from an Islamic perspective, right? And this is very important. If we're talking about fulfilling the shares, the idea of leaving everything to the spouse is not truly an Islamic plan. Now, you might say, well, look, we've been married 50 years and my husband's not going to get remarried. You notice in the example, the wife passed away because statistically the husband gets remarried at a higher rate, right? So I drew this deliberately. Now, there's another potential. I mean, we live in a litigious society. If you leave everything to your spouse, there's a possibility that somebody sues them and takes all their money. That's also theoretically possible, right? So there are different scenarios. It's not just a proverbial remarriage situation, but there's also creditor issues that may come into play. So, does everybody agree at this point that we need to do something? We need to have some sort of plan. There's a lot of issues. We have a religious obligation. We want to leave a legacy. We want to protect our family. We need to have some sort of plan. So let's say, what does the basic estate plan look like? Okay? The first famous document is what's known as a will. Everybody's heard of a will. I need to do a will. Okay? So on a basic level, everybody should have a will. And I'm going to talk about the limitations of the will in a second, but it's better than nothing. And it's important. If for no other reason, it provides guardianship for your children. Let me just get through them and then I'll take a question. So everyone should have at least a will. Power of attorney is important because we talked about in the event of incapacity, and a person might be incapacitated for a really long time. So who has control over those financial assets in the time of incapacity? That can be achieved by a power of attorney. Healthcare directives, I think, are very, very important, if not so much to dictate what happens on end of life, at least to clarify who gets to make those decisions. Right? Everybody remember the Terry Schiavo case out of Florida? Parents and spouse are fighting over what to do in the event of incapacity of a spouse. There's a famous case here in California on the definition of death. You all are probably familiar with it. In which the question was the girl brain dead or not? Anybody remember this case? It's very recent, from this year. and this incredibly difficult, long battle as to, you know, trying to keep this person alive when physicians were saying that she was brain dead, and, you know, the family said no. And so having clarity as to those issues is very, very important. At least picking people as who you want to make those decisions for you. Because, for instance, if I went and on behalf of my friend to the hospital, I'm sure there are physicians in the room, do I have any right to make a decision? No, nobody's going to listen to me. They're gonna say, who are you? Where are your documentation? Where's the HIPAA authorizations? Where's the healthcare power of attorney, the advance directive? You need to have something in place. And in many, many cases, a living trust. Who's heard of a trust? Some people have heard of a trust. We'll talk about a trust. Let me ask a question. You don't have to answer. But how many people have a basic estate plan in place? Right? Very low. Okay? So this is very important for our community to think about these issues. So, benefits of a last will. As I said, the most important thing is that you name guardians for your children. La samahullah, something happens to my wife and I. The most important, as we said in the beginning, is protecting our family. We want to ensure that the state doesn't take custody of our children. And the state doesn't want to take custody of your children. It may do so in the interim until some family members step up to resolve the issue and say, we'll be the guardians. However, what could very easily happen, if it's not spelled out, is two well-intentioned sets of relatives start to fight, right? So maybe a person's parents, right, the husband's parents and the wife's parents both say, we want custody of our grandchildren, we want to raise them, and now there's a family fight over a tragedy, right? So these things can be avoided with some level of planning. Similarly, for people who don't have close relatives in this country, right, who may have come here to work, this is critical, right? If you're thinking, well, I have relatives in Pakistan or Syria or wherever that are going to take care of my kids, how is that going to play? How's that going to work, right? It needs to be documented in writing. You need to name someone to be the personal representative or the executor of your estate, and you get to dictate what happens to your separate property assets. This is important because the will, the limitation is it still has to go through probate. Has anybody dealt with a probate before on the death of a loved one? Nobody has dealt with it. Good. Inshallah, we don't have to, but it's a very expensive, very onerous, very inefficient process. And as I said, California has statutory fees, which make it very lucrative for lawyers as well to run the probate. It's kind of like you can do some planning on the front end, or you can go to the ER on the back end. The cost is, you know, multiples higher on the back end through the probate process. Now, the second one is very important, which is a will doesn't control any assets that are jointly titled with the right of survivorship or any assets that have a beneficiary designation. Let's take an average person's profile of assets. Maybe they have a home that's jointly owned, a bank account that's jointly owned, an investment account that's jointly owned, a retirement account that has a beneficiary, and let's say from work they have a life insurance policy. What would the will control in that scenario? Nothing. Assuming I pass away, regardless of how nice my will is, what attorney I went to, right? It's not going to control anything because everything is going to go to, per the contract, to the surviving spouse or the person that's named as the beneficiary or the joint tenant with the right of survivorship. It's very important. So when people say, I need to do a will to fulfill my religious obligations, more often than not, you're not actually fulfilling the religious obligation there. Yes, Allah forbid, both spouses pass away in that car accident, then yes, the rules will come into play at that point, but that's statistically far less likely than one spouse passing away. So, the will has its pros, but it also has its cons, and typically if you go to an attorney, maybe they'll charge you a few $100s to do a whole plan that will incorporate a will and perhaps the other documents as well, and the prices range. I'm just giving you an overview. Now, that said, one of my goals is that every Muslim in America should at least have a will. Why? Because we avoid the guardianship dispute. La samahallah, there's a joint death situation. At least we have clarity as to who our assets are going to go to in that scenario. Or a person may have separate assets that this will govern, or they may not be married yet and they may have, the will may control in that scenario. So what we have is the opportunity to create a free basic will. It's an automated template. We're in Silicon Valley, we're using technology. So we developed a free will. Rather than taking a picture of this slide, I'm going to pause for a minute and ask you to actually take out your phones. Nobody in the masjid ever asks you to take out your phones. This is a chance. Take out your phones and just text this number. Okay? You text MCC to 444999. This is the way that you're going to get the link and you're going to have the opportunity to receive an automated email that's going to have all this information as well as a text message. So if you text it, I'll give you 2 minutes. It's going to ask you 2 questions. It's going to ask for your email and it's going to ask for your name. That's it. And then you'll get, we won't send you a bunch of text messages after that, don't worry. But you'll have the link for the free will, and you'll also have the opportunity to do a free consult if you're interested tomorrow. You'll get a text message back in a separate, from a separate number. When you get that message, it'll ask for your email, and then it'll ask for your full name, so that we have it. So as you're working on that, you can continue. I'm going to say, how does this work? So, you'll have a link in your email to create a free will. You go online, you put in your information, who you want to select as guardian for your children, who you want to be the personal representative or executor of your estate. And in addition, it asks for your family members, and it'll calculate for you who your heirs are under Islamic law. It's a pretty powerful tool, alhamdulillah. Very excited to release it, and I think inshallah, and it'll allow you to leave a gift, a charitable gift, for instance, for the masjid, for a educational institution, religious organization, anything that you like, or some other relatives. If a person has, this question was raised, if a person has, say, relatives that are not Muslim, if the person has nieces or nephews or people that want to you want to support family members back home, you can leave from that wasiyah share a gift for them. Now this is a simple tool, so it's not designed for complex cases. It's not designed, think of it like TurboTax, right? If you don't have a lot, you can do your taxes on TurboTax. It's free. You have a little bit more, then they have a little higher version, and if you have more, typically you go to an accountant, right? And so if you have complex issues, if you have sophisticated assets, if you are high net worth, or you want to just make sure that things are in order, I would encourage you to consult with an attorney. So this is the process for creating your basic will. Once you get that document, you can print it out, and the law requires you to sign it in front of 2 witnesses. These witnesses should be independent. They shouldn't be like your wife and kids who are going to inherit. That's a conflict, doesn't make sense. Pick 2 individuals who are unrelated to you. Preferably, you should also do it in front of a notary so that it's very, very technically sound and there's no question of validity. So again, as I said, not a perfect solution by any means, but a better than nothing solution. Considering most people said they don't have anything, this I would say is much better than nothing, and a good start for the future. A better alternative for Muslims in America. Again, that number, just so it'll come back at the end, it was 444999 to MCC. The better alternative, in my view, is a living trust. So who's heard of a trust again? Who has a trust? Few people have a trust, few people have heard about a trust. Conceptually, a trust is just a bucket. It's a bucket, you put your stuff in the bucket. So now, because the bucket never dies, it never goes to probate. Who's heard of kicking the bucket? Anybody heard the term kicking the bucket? My dad, well, protect him and bless him, he's a physician. He said in his training, one time he was training when he had just come to the country, and he walked into a meet with a patient, and the patient asked him, "Doc, do you think I'm going to kick the bucket?" And he didn't know what it meant, so he was like, "Sure, anytime." And the patient was like mortified. Then he said, "Do you know what that means?" And then it means dying, right? So I don't know that if it has anything to do with the living trust or not, but think of the bucket as, think of the trust as a bucket. And when a person passes away, the bucket doesn't die. So the next person in line, the trustee, is just going to govern the assets inside of the trust. So we're actually going to transfer your house into the trust. And we're actually going to name the trust as a beneficiary of the various accounts and so on and so forth, and retitle a lot of assets. It's actually much more comprehensive planning. So we said we transfer assets into the trust while you're alive. You maintain control. You're still in charge. You're not giving them away. You're going to be the trustee, you and your wife, for instance. Avoids probate and allows for much better compliance with Islamic law. Why? Because there's no judge that's looking over to determine whether this is good or not. The risk of the will is that a judge can look at it and say, Sharia, Islam, I hate that, and I'm going to throw it out. Now, likely you're going to call care, they're going to fight it, they're going to win, but you just wasted a bunch of time, money, efficiency, right? Because a trial court judge can do whatever they want. So let's take it out of the hands of a judge and just pick people that you trust. Your relatives, your professionals, your fiduciaries, whomever you want, to make those decisions and to fulfill your wishes for you. A trust is valid in every state. You don't have to have an ancillary probate. Let's say you have property here in California, you have property in Arizona, you have property in Texas. You got to do a probate in every state. Now your costs are just going higher and higher. So you want to avoid that. You can title your trust assets from different states. You can put them into your California trust, so on and so forth. And this is probably the most important thing. It allows you to clarify ownership. Now, in that scenario, when we talked about the husband is earning and they have a joint bank account, what's the assumption of that joint bank account? Is it that it's 50-50? Is it that it's 100-0? What is the ownership? What about those separately titled bank accounts? In other words, we live in a community property state. If I have a bank account and my wife has a bank account, and one's in my name and one's in her name, does that mean under the law that the account that's titled in my name is mine and the account that's titled in her name is hers? But our names are on it. It doesn't, because it's community property. So again, the assumption is whoever's earning what, regardless, it's mixed. Right? So we might not have any idea. What good are the Islamic fractions, the Quranic fractions, if we don't know what we own? How can I divide 1/6 to my mom? How can I give 1/6 to my mom if I don't know what's mine? Right? This is very critical from an Islamic perspective. Right? Again, you might say, well, you know what, everything goes to myself, it's no big deal, but my parents have a haqq upon my wealth. And that's from my portion of the wealth. Right? Yes. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. Yeah, we're going to wrap up here in a second. Now, trust costs more, typically somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000. So that's typically drafting, transferring properties, putting things in. A person owns a business, a person owns LLCs, rental properties. You account for every single asset. So the cost is obviously higher. The cost of probate may be 10 times higher or 20 times higher, which is avoided by doing some front-end planning. Last few points here before Salah, and then we'll take questions and answers after Salah, are additional benefits of the trust are business succession planning. So a person has a family business, what happens to that business, right? Most businesses die when the owner dies. So how do we have these, famous families in American history? They were very good at succession planning. Charitable planning, as we said, how do we build endowments? How do we make sure that our unfulfilled religious obligations are taken care of towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And asset protection, right? Person is a doctor, person is somebody who's susceptible to lawsuits. How do we protect and prevent our assets from, going over to others? And last slide here is basically a few examples of when a trust versus a will. When should you do what? So basically the first is someone who went surfing, died in a shark attack, had a small rental home, modest checking account, 401k, which named his parents as beneficiaries, and had a daughter. What would that person need in your assessment of this presentation? Maybe a will is fine because the daughter is young. If it goes to the parents, this person's not married, his wife previously died in a surfing accident, and so if it goes to the parents will maybe take care of the children. Perhaps a will is okay. Obviously a trust is always better, but in that scenario, maybe it's okay. Sumayya is the founder of a successful furniture business. After a long bout with cancer, her husband of 21 years passes away. She has 19-year-old twins. What about in that scenario? Right? Anytime you have a successful business, you own property, especially property that's free and clear, right? A trust is always going to be better. You want to prevent the business from losing its value. You want to prevent the probate and all of those things. Last one is Dr. Khan has a 2-person medical practice, dies suddenly at the age of 33 in a car crash. What do you think of this scenario? Probably because there's 2 partners, right? What goes to his share? How is it paid out? Whenever there's a partnership, there's a lot more complexity. How does the family benefit from his share in the business, so on and so forth. Again, likely a scenario in which a trust would be better. So we'll close with this. Jazakumullahu khairan. What I will say is we'll take questions after Salah, inshallah. And anyone who wants to, if you filled out that 444999 MCC text, you'll get a link to be able to schedule a free consult. So this is if you want to discuss your situation further, you can do that. Zain and I will be here tomorrow, inshallah. That link will allow you to select a time. We'll meet in the back room here in the masjid tomorrow. I think most of those slots are already taken. If they are all filled tomorrow, you can schedule a time during the week. You can do it all from your phone. And we'll do a conference call or a video call back in Arizona. Those calls are free. Like I said, the goal is if you need assistance, inshallah, we'll be able to provide that for you. Zain is local, so we'll be able to do all of the implementation, transfer of assets, all of those things for you, as well as if you want to do sophisticated charitable planning and tax planning as well. So jazakumullah khairan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to benefit and to understand these rules and to implement them and to allow us to leave a legacy that benefits our families and benefits our communities. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. And as I said, after Isha we'll take questions. I'm sure there's a bunch and I didn't take them, so jazakumullahu khairan for your time. Till about 5. Okay, there's a few appointments left. Correct. It does lead to litigation most likely because they might
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا